Hi, I'm Chris Lee, and this is Virtually Speaking. Joining us today is Andy Stumpf, a retired Navy SEAL who is highly decorated, including 5 Bronze Star medals, 4 with Valor, and the Purple Heart. In Andy's illustrious 17-year SEAL career, he became a member of the most elite counterterrorism unit in the military, SEAL Team 6, which is a small unit that is tasked with some of the nation's most critical missions and which is the subject of many a Hollywood film. One of Andy's team's missions was rescuing Jessica Lynch during the Iraq War. On another mission, Andy was shot at close range with an AK-47 by an Iraqi insurgent. Andy executed hundreds of combat operations throughout the world in support of the global war on terror. He became a commissioned officer, the first E6 selection commissioned through the Limited Duty Officer Program in the history of Naval Special Warfare. Andy is also one of the top skydivers and base jumpers in the world and has held the world record jump for longest distance flown in a wingsuit, which was a jump from 36,000 feet and covered over 18 miles distance. Andy has his own popular podcast, Cleared Hot, and has been featured all across major media, including CNBC, Inc. magazine, The New York Times, Wired, and many more, and multiple appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and on CBS's TV reality show, Hunted, as a hunter of fugitives. So please join me now with the incomparable Andy Stumpf.
To go up that high in altitude, you're going into a place where people don't survive. If your oxygen failed at that altitude, you could black out. You could die just from spinning in that suit.
We're going into no man's land, touching the bounds of space. There's no air. If something happens, how long can you hold your breath?
Well, hello, Andy Stumpf. Thank you for joining me today on Virtually Speaking. How are you doing, sir?
I am doing pretty well. I'm sure I could find some complaints, but so far so good.
So you went into the armed forces at age 17, right?
Correct. Well, I didn't go into the armed forces when I was 17. I signed paperwork with my parents' consent. It's called the Delayed Entry Program, which, looking back on it, is actually a way essentially for recruiters to fill their billets monthly. Because I was still in high school, you need a GED or a high school diploma, so I had to finish that. And you need to be 18 before you actually begin your enlistment. So it was more than anything. I know I've heard people, when it comes to colleges, they'll sign letters of intent. That's largely the letter of intent for joining the military.
Did you know for years that you wanted to get into the military before that, or was it just like within a year or two? Because I don't imagine 13-year-olds necessarily or 14-year-olds necessarily thinking, I want to be. And did you want to be in the Navy, or did you know you wanted to be a SEAL? Like, where did that all come from?
So it's a common theme that people want to talk about, or they'll ask me about, because for me it was very early, and it's hard to put an exact pin on a calendar of when it was, but I would say somewhere between 10 and 11 years old.
Wow.
I settled in on knowing that I wanted to be a SEAL, and it's not because it was a family legacy or lineage, even though on my father's side of the house, they all did serve in the Navy. My dad worked peripherally with SEALs in Vietnam. He was a gunner on a patrol boat, so he was an insertion and an extraction platform for them. And I'm pretty sure I first heard the term in a conversation with him about Vietnam when I was working for him. And then on my mom's side of the house, it was all Army. She was an Army brat with her 4 sisters. So I came from a military family, but they in no way, shape, or form ever expressed the desire for me to join the military. But as soon as I had heard about what a SEAL was, and I started developing an understanding, at least at that point in time, of what I thought the career would be or what I thought the job would be, It sunk its hooks into me pretty deeply, to the point where, I never took the SATs. I never applied to college, and I'm not recommending that path for anybody else, because it wasn't until years later that I realized, my plan B was going to be an in extremis plan B. If I needed one, I was going to be making it up on the fly.
Right.
It worked out well for me, but statistically, that's not the way that it's going to work out for most people. But it's what I wanted to do. It's hard to describe why. I still can't. I mean, even with a better vocabulary now in my 40s, it's better to. It's hard still to describe exactly why. And it's uncommon for people to hear that somebody knew what they wanted to do from that age. But
Yeah.
I was surrounded by people every day
Right.
who really expressed the same things. It was one of the most common narratives inside of the community, of people, young men who decided and just had this gravitational pull towards the community. And it was a pretty unique environment to be working with and for people who all felt the same way.
So you said your dad worked with the SEALs. Weren't the SEALs a relatively newer branch or facet of the Navy? I mean, when did they come into existence? Wasn't it like only a decade or two before that or something?
Early 60s. So the
Okay.
predecessor of the SEALs were the UDT, or the underwater demolition teams. And they were all the way back to, World War II, World War I, doing amphibious reconnaissance, looking for obstacles or barricades to beach landings. And they were tasked with, one, surveying the beach and making room for landing craft. So they'd go in and they would destroy those obstacles. But JFK, actually President Kennedy, commissioned SEAL Team 1 and 2 in the early 60s. So by the time Vietnam came around, I would describe it as they were still transitioning from that UDT role to a more unconventional warfare, maritime warfare force at that time. And in Vietnam, there were UDT teams and SEAL teams, and it wasn't until post-Vietnam that the Navy consumed, or the SEAL teams community consumed, both of them, and the UDT teams went away, and the SEAL teams continued on.
Wow. And so the SEALs were really conceived of to be a unconventional unit that could kind of be used here and there and anywhere. And was there something
Typically,
specifically they were created for?
maritime. 70% of the earth is covered in water, so probably not a bad idea to have a small, nimble element that can originate from the water, operate on land, and then go back into the water. That was the original. Well, actually, it's still the purpose, the definition and the purpose of the SEAL teams. Every special operation unit has what's called MEDALs, which is mission essential task lists, and it's their legacy tasks, things that you have to be able to do. And for the SEAL community, the vast majority of those, even though we operate mostly on land in the modern era, the vast majority of those medals still involve the maritime environment.
Yeah, because you guys were asked to go into Pakistan and Iraq, and there were a lot of places you guys have been where there's almost no water.
Well, and even a lot of the places where they're going, even if that country or continent touches the water, they're not starting operations from the water. They're
Right.
starting from landlocked forward operating bases. So again, even though they're doing all of that, the training inside of the SEAL community is still maritime focused at times, because we still have to be responsible, or
Sure.
they, I should say, because I'm obviously not active, they still have to be responsible for all of those things that a commanding general might task them. I mean, you don't know, you might be overseas working out of a base. And this actually happened to me my last tour in Afghanistan. They wanted us to go do a body recovery. There was an army unit that was crossing a river, and one of the guys slipped in heavily laden equipment that was non-positively buoyant, so he sank. And they start looking for people in that environment who are specialists in water. So we were actually breaking out dive gear. We ended up not having to do that because the body was recovered. But you never know, the point being. So you have to be current and competent in all those skills.
Yeah, and you were a member of the most elite SEAL team, if I may say so, which is SEAL Team 6, which is the one where at some point along the line, I guess it was earmarked as the most elite of them all, I guess, and used in the most special of circumstances. Is that something that's true always or recently? And is that something that you were aiming for when you entered the SEALs? Like, I want to be a member of Team 6.
I didn't even know it existed when
Okay.
I joined. I didn't find out until years later. I would not use the term the most elite or more elite. What I would say is it's different. The conventional SEAL teams, and I don't say that negatively or pejoratively, the conventional SEAL teams focus on a very broad variety of tasks. Development Group, or SEAL Team 6, focuses on a much more narrow set of tasks. And if you have less things that you're responsible for, you can really just hone the razor's edge. So it allows them to, they're not more elite. It allows them to specialize in fewer things and therefore have more competency than a lot of their peers. That's how I would describe it.
But when like Jessica Lynch needs to be rescued, or when we need to get Osama bin Laden, SEAL Team 6 is the team that's sent in.
It could be, so a development group is part of, there's Special Operations Command, which is conventional Special Operations Forces, that whole community. And then there's JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, that has a variety of tier 1 units. One of them is development group. The other one is, I'll leave out what they're called now, but traditionally or historically they were called Delta Force. So the Army's component of JSOC. And it's very likely that in that situation for both of those things, either of those units could have been called, because those are the units that specialize in hostage rescue or high value target assaults. So again, it might have been truly a matter of timing, or a lot of times, there's more missions that need to go down than people who are available to do them. So it could have been one of those commands was task saturated in another geographic area, which provided more opportunity for a different or another one of the commands inside of JSOC. And what I'll say is this: I've deployed with the Army component of JSOC, and they are phenomenal operators. And I would say at that level, the capability is damn near identical from the Army side of the house to the Navy side of the house.
And so how many people are on that team that when you go in to get Jessica Lynch?
That we were limited by the helicopters. So we had what was called a HAF and a GAF, a helicopter assault force and a ground assault force, because we had, I think, 4 Little Birds and 3 UH-60 Blackhawks. So you're going to get 4 people per Little Bird, and probably it was a short flight, so they might have been able to stuff in 10 guys per Blackhawk. But you need to take the roof and you need to assault the ground floor as well. So I think we hit that with somewhere between 30 to 40 guys.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And what, did it go well? Was it easy to get in and get out, or was it more of a seriously dangerous situation?
We had intelligence that there was going to be, that they were using the hospital as a staging base for fighters, which they were, but they left the day before we showed up. So there was no resistance on target. There was a little bit of shooting at the external perimeter that was pretty pushed out farther away from the hospital, but
wow.
She was not in the room that we had intelligence that she was in, but we found her, I'd say 30 or 45 seconds later, and she was out of that hospital within maybe 10 minutes of us being off the ground. And then off to the helicopter took her to an airplane that was just sitting in wait at a desert landing strip. It was, I forget what they call it. I think it's a MAU. It's a surgical aircraft, essentially. It has a full surgical suite. She got put onto that and then medevaced out of the country. So it was relatively quick, but anticlimactic for sure.
Well, still an amazing thing that you guys did, getting her and getting her out safely. But so you had her on your show, Cleared Hot. She was one of your first guests, I guess, right?
I'd have to go back and check the numbers, but I think it was inside of like the first 30 or 40. So it was early on for sure. Yeah.
That's great that you guys were able to get back and talk about your sides of the story and kind of, check in with each other that way. That's great. And I heard she's like a school teacher now, and she's
she seems to be doing well. She got a daughter. She had never talked to anybody who was there that day, which is crazy to me.
When she talked to you, she had never, wow.
She had never met anybody who was a part of the rescue/assault. So it was really cool to sit down, talk with it from her perspective, talk about it from my perspective. It was really interesting, melding of the two worlds.
Yeah. So when you go into something like that, when you're about to go into a major, and at that point, I think it was pretty public that she had been captured and that we needed to rescue her and we were going to rescue her. So when you're sitting there, this goes to one of the most important things that you talk about as a thought leader, which is really, teamwork, but also communication and preparedness, and really getting ready for this extraction. So my question is, you always do this. You always prepare. SEALs are amazing at looking at what they're about to do and looking and preparing for all the different scenarios. This must have been one where there was like a lot of tension and a lot of, focus and a lot of extra. We got to get this right because the whole world is watching, kind of a thing. Because some of the stuff you do, nobody knows you're doing, but this is something everybody was going to find out about. So it must have been a very interesting prep session before you went and did that, right?
No, actually, it was just like any other target. And you talk to the guys. I know I'm friends with a lot of guys who went on the Bin Laden raid, and they said exactly the same thing.
Wow.
Relatively certain that he was going to be there, but you treat it like any other military operation. You don't do anything special on
Right.
game. There's no template that you deviate from because you think it's going to be game day, in air quotes. You have the most realistic training that you can have leading up to it. You have standard operating procedures and what we call TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that you fall back on. And you don't change them just because it might be a higher value target or not.
Did you know who you were going in to get? And did you know that the whole world knew that she had been captured and that's what you guys were about to embark on? Or was it just like, we're going to go do this? We don't know exactly. I mean, I guess you
No,
had to know.
we knew exactly who we were going for. We waited till we had proof of her life, that she was alive in the hospital to launch. I don't remember how much had been talked about when it came to her capture. I think a lot of that might have come out just about the same time that we rescued her. But even if the world had been watching, to use your terminology, nothing would have changed from the planning process to the execution.
So tell us a little bit about this process, because I know it's one where you guys get it right and you have a lot of the wrong things that can happen planned for. So you're ready for it. So when something goes wrong, we're not wasting any time. We know exactly what to do next. Tell us a little bit about that process.
I mean, I would describe, when you're talking about having things prepared for stuff that can go wrong, we call that contingency planning. Or another way people will talk about it, plan for the what ifs. So obviously you plan an operation to go down. You're going to have generally a primary, secondary, and tertiary plan for each phase of the operation, from where you're going to go to the objective to then you're on the helicopters, then you're waiting, all of these different phase lines that we cross. And we have a primary, secondary, and tertiary plan for both. And then you spin off into the contingencies. And I would say we spend, anecdotally, 75 to 80% of the time planning on the contingencies, those what ifs, because it's just easier to plan through life-threatening decisions when your life isn't being threatened. It's easier to work your way through very complex decisions when there's no compression of time or threat to your life. So you go in the field on a military operation. If you could get everything down to a branch diagram, that would be amazing, because that just relieves so much pressure from leadership, both at the junior level and the senior level. So a lot of the time, is spent on planning. The vast majority of the time overseas is spent on planning. The vast minority of the time is spent on target, but that success on target is directly related to the emphasis that you put into that planning phase.
And I've heard you say that if you were to make a real accurate movie about the SEALs,
it would be boring. People would hate it because it would be, let's call it your average 2-hour Hollywood movie. It would be an hour and 50 minutes of people sitting in front of computers doing PowerPoint and then rehearsals and then briefing, 2 minutes of flying on a helicopter, 5 minutes of being on target, and then 3 minutes of flying back. Like that would be it. That would be the movie. And people would absolutely hate it and it would bomb in Hollywood.
Right. So you're not a big fan of the Hollywood movie depicting SEALs.
I view Hollywood as entertainment, so therefore I can be a fan. I'm not looking at it for education, which saves me a lot of stress and elevated heart rate. So I just watch to enjoy the movies. I know a lot of guys who watch it and all they want to do is pick out the inaccuracies. And to be clear and fair, I also see them. And if you watch a military movie with me, it's not going to be an enjoyable experience for you, but I can appreciate what it is that they're trying to do.
Because you're going to point everything out.
Yes. Some of it is glaring, just utterly glaring.
Right. Well, yeah, I assume with many professions that people who are experts at what they do are looking at stuff and going, that's not real. In fact,
I'm sure lawyers who watch Law and Order have a few things to say, or doctors that watch ER. I mean, come on, it's the same issue.
Yeah.
I mean, they're there to sell soap on the advertisement breaks. So you got to have the highest entertainment value and probably therefore the lowest authenticity value.
But it's awesome to hear. And I know when you went out into the private sector after, so when you left the SEALs, you left the Navy, was because of an injury. Is that correct?
There was one major injury in 2005, and then I would say there was a bunch of other minor injuries that terminated in me being medically retired. So another way to look at that is essentially my body was not capable of continuing along the career path that I would need to achieve my 20. I would have had to do 22 years to retire instead of 20 because I switched over to being an officer at my 12-year mark. So they reset your retirement calculator by 10 years. It just wasn't possible. So I was medically retired, which saved me my pension and benefits.
Okay, that's good.
Yep.
So when you get back into the topic of preparedness and how to prepare for crisis, that obviously can help you in a lot of facets in life, in a lot of areas. When you came out of the military and you went into the private sector, you probably noticed that these tools were going to help you a lot. And I think that I've heard you say you were surprised that some of the most successful companies you've worked with and consulted with, they had very similar ways of doing things as the SEALs.
I have found that successful teams, highly successful organizations and teams, they're largely structured the same, and they have the same template that they play from. They have an understanding of leadership. They have an understanding of communication, of empowering their subordinates, and they focus on those things. And I would love to say that the leadership lessons that I learned in the SEAL community were unique to the SEAL community, but they're not. I mean, the things that I learned, you could go all the way back to the Spartans. And I'm sure that the best leaders of that time were operating on the same principles that were taught to me by people who missed the Vietnam War, but were taught those lessons by people from the Vietnam War, who were taught those lessons by people from World War II. It just goes on and on and on. And, people look at the military as if it's a very unique organization. And what I would say is that the role of the military is very unique, but it's a broad spectrum of society with every race, belief, gender, religion, fill in the blank, all smashed together and with a goal, or like I said, an end state that is uncommon. But the leadership that you use inside of the military, it's not just military leadership. People, and I'm sure you have, as somebody who works in the space with speakers, I'm sure you've had people come to you and say, hey, we want somebody who understands military leadership. And what that person is missing is that leadership is leadership.
Yeah.
You could have somebody from the military come talk about leadership, but if your organization is squared away, hopefully what you're going to be hearing is somebody repeating the same narrative and model that you're already using inside of your organization. There's no such thing as military leadership. There's no such thing as Fortune 50 leadership or 500 or 100. There's really two types, and that is good, or another way you could describe that is effective, or bad, and another way to describe that would be ineffective. But you can pull all of the business titles away from that, all of the job-specific roles away from that. It's really what it comes down to.
That's interesting. And but I think that there is a big difference, though, which is, I think, what's alluring to people is that there's this element with your job and your former job, which is this element of danger and this element of fear. And how do we deal with the intense fear of all the different things that you were asked to do, as opposed to us in a boardroom or us in a merger or us in a fight with another company or somebody who's upset with how our company did business. It's on a grander scale, I think. So I think that the lessons of how you dealt with fear and how you dealt with crisis are really, really important for us all to learn from. We are in a pandemic right now. How do we overcome the fear of anything that's going on in our lives? And I would think that you have a lot to share.
The difference between the boardroom and the battlefield is generally time. The amount of time between when you make a decision and you suffer the consequences of that decision on the battlefield is short. In the boardroom, it can be long, and that can lead people to believe that it's not important. But, there are actually lives at risk in the boardroom as well, too. And I'll go back to the real estate boom and the bubble that came after that. Do a little bit of research on depression rates and suicide rates for people that lost everything, who lost their homes, who lost their jobs, who were financially destroyed. It drastically went up on both of those. Now, did they happen overnight? They certainly didn't. It happened in boardrooms across the United States where greed took over and logic left the room. And people died because of it. And the difference between, again, a battlefield decision where you make a decision and something catastrophic happens and a timeline that might be 12, 16, 18, 24 months, when there's less of a time compression, people seem to take things less seriously. And I would always caution you against doing that.
So, how do you let fear influence you? How did you let it affect you?
I don't. That's the goal. Fear is a completely natural emotion. It should be respected. And the fact that you have fear is actually a good sign. Generally, what it is a warning. Your body is saying, hey, perhaps we should pay a little bit more attention to what's going on, because the level of consequence to whatever it might be, you're standing next to the ledge of a cliff or getting ready to make a huge financial decision, there's probably some gravity to what it is that you're doing. That's great. You should have fear, but you should never allow fear to interrupt or interact with your decision-making cycle. Emotions are terrible leaders, but they're great followers. You need to be logical. You need to be objective. And if you allow emotions to take over in your decision-making process, I know of no upside whatsoever, but almost unlimited downside. So it's not a matter of not being scared. It's a matter of not allowing your fear to be the mechanism that is controlling what you're doing.
So when you feel the panic come on and you feel the fear come on, how do you yourself manage that? What's your instinctual thought process there?
It would really depend on the situation. If it's a physical threat to life versus
Right.
an uncertainty of a decision. But again, you have to, for me, when it comes to decisions, oftentimes I'll write things out. I'll write out the variables that I can control and the variables that I cannot control.
Mm.
For most human beings in life, you actually really can't control that much. The one thing you have complete and utter control over the entire time is actually only yourself. So
how you react to it, right?
How you react to it. Yes. You can't control what happens to you often, but you always have control over how you receive and respond what happens to you. So for me, the key is recognizing that I am experiencing those emotions and then doing everything I can to detach that emotion from my decision-making process. Overseas, sometimes that was literally, take a knee and take a breath and just take that extra second to de-escalate yourself emotionally and not allow those emotions to take control. And one of the best ways to do that is you've got all of your crisis planning already done. You have
Right.
standard procedures to fall back on. You have weeks and months and years and decades of extremely difficult training that you can fall back on. You have your experience. You're surrounded by a highly functioning team. All of those things, they help you reduce that emotional burden because it absolutely is present. And I have seen people on the battlefield completely emotionally consumed, and they're very dangerous because they're not in control. Like I said, emotions are great followers, but they're terrible, terrible leaders because you're just not in control. You have to be objective. You have to be logical. And to do that, you have to be very critical of yourself and you have to be self-aware, which is oftentimes difficult to do as a leader.
Yeah. And so at one point you were shot, right?
Yep.
So was this later in your career or was it early on?
It was 10 years into my career.
Okay. And had you been in situations before that where you could have gotten shot or you were almost shot, but you hadn't been?
I don't think you ever really know when you were almost shot. You can hear
like bullets going by, but they didn't hit you.
Yeah, you can never really tell how close though. So that's a tough one to judge, but yeah, hundreds of times.
So at some point where you think of yourself, I'm good, or I'm lucky, or not really even thinking about it at all. And then all of a sudden now you're faced with a situation where it did happen. Mm-hmm. And it was at pretty close range, right? With an AK-47, right?
Yeah, it was about 15 feet away. Wow. I never got to a place in my career where I thought that I was good, or that I thought that the improvement paradigm or continuum was over. And I actually think if you ever arrive at that at any point in time in any career, you need to move on because it's probably where you're the most dangerous to yourself or the people that are around you. No, I mean, I was always critically aware of the risk, and we all were because we spent a vast majority of time doing risk assessment and risk mitigation.
Right.
So, I mean, you know what you're getting into. It's just that's the rules of the game that we played.
So were you completely caught off guard? Tell us a little bit about that moment.
I mean, again, anticlimactic. Sometimes you're looking in a direction and somebody's head will come up and you don't see them and they get the jump on you. I mean, that's the simplest way that I can put it. Spent a lot of time trying to think back about whether or not I had done something wrong.
Hmm.
And the reality was, most people have been to Vegas, and if you go to Vegas and just go to a crap table and watch for a bit, and you'll see people who would just go on these amazing strings of throwing number after number after number after number. But give me a long enough timeline. Those casinos they're not built by giving money away. They're built by raking money back towards the dealer or the pit boss. And you'll see people on those runs in Vegas, and eventually, give them that long enough timeline, they'll roll a 7. And I think to some degree, that job is, statistically, there's math involved around that as well. You'll come out on top over and over and over again. And then, at some point in time, you may find yourself on the other side of that coin. And when that happens, hopefully you have at least a little bit of luck as to what type of injury you sustain or where you sustain it on your body.
So, that brings me to something that I think about sometimes, which is, with people who are speakers and thought leaders and experts who are champions, who are the great ones, the GOATs, or just at the top of their industry or the top of whatever they're doing. But even with those people, there is a ton of failure. There is a ton of loss. There's a ton of uncertainty and doubt and everything. So I think it's important for everybody to realize, like, even a SEAL Team 6 member and a guy who won a lot of or was awarded a lot of medals, things can happen to all of us. Nobody's perfect. And it's important for us to all realize that there's no one person who's really, even Tom Brady lost Super Bowls. He didn't win every Super Bowl he was in.
Yeah.
So that's important for, I think, people to remember, is like, even the people who look like the winners and look like the best of the best, they had to go through a lot to get there. And I'm sure you've seen that a lot with your peers from the military, but also in the corporate world.
People don't want to believe me when I say that career field, the SEAL career field, it's populated by extremely common people who deal with every single problem, whether it's financial, personal, mental health, relationships, substance abuse, addiction, alcoholism, fill in the blank. It's common people who have a job that's very uncommon. It truly is very, very normal people who are tasked with doing something that is very abnormal. And with people in general come problems, and those are unavoidable.
Do you think that a SEAL is better equipped to deal with those harsh circumstances, or those tough things that happen in their lives, those losses, or those blips on the radar?
I think everybody has blind spots. There's no suit of armor that's perfect. I would say from a physical discomfort place, yeah, probably most guys who make it through training, they're going to be well at dealing with things that are physically based. But some of the most damaging things, there are wounds that you can't see because they're between the ears. So sometimes in some circumstances, I think the biggest danger is that the guys think that they're impervious to everything, and it can lead them down a very, very dangerous path.
What would you say would be the number one thing that you learned as a SEAL that people in business and professionally should look at and maybe focus more on? Is it more of just looking at your surroundings better and planning better for whatever you're about to do, rather than just not planning for it? I mean, what do you think would be the number one or the top two couple of things that you see people not doing as much as they should be, that you were really taught as a SEAL?
I mean, I'll break it into operationally and then individually. So like from an organizational perspective, again, we talked about this a little bit. The reality of why the SEAL community can do amazing things, it's all about the things that don't show up in Hollywood movies. It's about the training, the crawl, walk, run philosophy, and making sure that at each phase of training that everybody, not just the senior people, but the new people, they're working seamlessly together, and you layer complexity only after you have fundamental principles completely hammered in. And most of what happens in combat is very low speed, very fundamental. There's not a lot of high speed maneuvers that we were able to pull off. So it's the opposite of complex. It's very simple. Contingency planning and just so much planning goes into those operations. And the best thing I could say for organizations is make your critical decisions before they become critical. So spend that time on your what ifs and your contingency planning. On the individual perspective, we talked about this as well, and that's your ability to maintain control of your emotions at all times. Meaning, we talked about it in the perspective of fear. When you ask me how does fear, how does it work for me, or how does it interact in what I do? And my answer again was it doesn't. Or I should say, the more honest answer would be is I do the best I can to not allow it to. I'm not perfect, obviously, and I've had my moments, but maintaining control of your emotions, specifically and especially as a leader, is so incredibly powerful because everybody's watching you. If you're in a leadership position, they're watching you, they're listening to you, they're observing your behavior, and most importantly, they are ready and willing to soak that up and repeat whatever it is they see from you. So it can impact and affect everybody that is around you. And it's a learned skill. It's a learned trait. It takes time. And when I tell people, when it comes to leadership, a lot of people in business, they want to wait until they have a certain job title or an office or a parking space or an acronym on their business card to start thinking about themselves as a leader. That's not necessarily a good idea. We use the analogy of a driver's license. I have children now who are of driving age, and I did not recommend to them, hey, let's just put off any driving or studying until it's the day of your test, then go see how it works out for you. Because the answer is it's not going to work out at all. But in the business world, I see this all the time. People who, I'm not a leader yet. I'm not in a leadership position. So they don't think about themselves as a leader. They don't practice that emotional control. They don't practice that decision-making. And my advice is wherever you are right now, regardless of your rank, and this was something that was expected in the SEAL teams, from the junior man to the senior man, in the absence of leadership, you are expected to step up and fill that leadership void. And I think the business world would be better off if they practice that as well. Day one, start hammering into your people that at all times you will think of yourself and conduct yourself as a leader. So when you get that corner office or whatever metric that you're using for success, you're already prepared, as opposed to trying to figure out what's going on your first day.
That's amazing advice. That's really cool. And I don't want to forget to bring up the fact that you jump out of airplanes, you've jumped off cliffs for many years. So this is obviously something, is this something all SEAL people have to get good at, or did you specifically want to do that and that was one of your fortes as well?
So all SEALs get trained in static line and free fall jumping. It's an insertion platform. I pursued it at a much deeper level than most do.
Right.
Because it stuck with me. The first time I jumped out of a plane, free fall, not static line. Static line just feels like jumping off a 20-story building onto concrete. That was not awesome. But the first time I jumped out of a plane in free fall and you're falling through the air, I was like, this is awesome. So for me, that just stuck with me. Other guys are like, meh, they want to go sport diving or they want to drive rally cars, fill in the blanks, whatever hooks people.
But the first time you jumped out of an airplane was obviously when you were training.
Yes.
And you've done many, many of those. And then, of course, you broke the world record for longest distance flown by a person in a wingsuit, period, which was, I think, 17 miles, right?
It's like 18.25 miles.
Oh,
And it was broken a few years ago by a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. And good on him. I have no desire to go back. I did it as a fundraiser.
I don't know if he raised $1 million, though.
Yeah, I fell short of that goal though too. Raising money is one of the most difficult things I've ever done. Raising money is a journey in and of itself of hardship and fighting donor fatigue.
So, have you done that again? Was that just that one time and you're kind of like,
I have no desire to repeat that. None.
You were at 35,000 feet. There's a lot of danger there.
There's a lot of risk there. I don't know necessarily if there's a lot of danger. We took all the steps possible to reduce any, again, risk assessment, risk mitigation. I wouldn't have done it if I thought it was overly dangerous. I have no problem accepting calculated risk, but I refuse to gamble.
Smart. Well, thank you so much for being here and for coming on and having this conversation with me, Andy. I've been looking forward to it a lot. And I love telling people about you as a speaker. You're a very easy one for me to tell people about, because there's so many great things about you that are likable. And these topics are so important right now, of leadership and, preparedness, and how do we talk to ourselves, and how do we deal with crisis? How do we prepare for anything, and leadership, and really teamwork in general. So these are all really important right now. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.